I asked the Yu-Gi-Oh! Twitter community what are the best budget Yu-Gi-Oh! decks. Some of y'all did not disappoint. A lot of y'all need therapy. Today I'm gonna be ranking the top budget Yu-Gi-Oh! decks all the way from the best budget, get the noodle diet, down to just pay the bills instead. Of course, big dog, as usual, I hope your day is going phenomenal. But if it isn't, don't let what happened at the beginning of your day ruin the rest of your day. Let's jump on in. Let's go ahead and start off this tier list with the strategy that you guys suggested to me on Twitter. I would say Altergeist got some really cool support from Duelist Nexus, and now because of the 25th Anniversary Collection set, it got Pot of Prosperity, which is now accessible to all budget players. I would say because of this, Altergeist is in the C tier. It's not a bad Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck whatsoever, but two major problems were concerned. The first is that if your opponent is going first and has already got theirs set up, it's going to be incredibly hard for Altergeist to be able to play through it. The second one is just as alarming. Even when you're going first, if your opponent has one card to disrupt you, it really does messes with your momentum and is more likely that you'll completely lose the game because of it. One thing I will say about Altergeist is that when it is allowed to play, it is an incredibly scary Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, and sometimes can even play around those weaknesses with the correct player. I would then go ahead and put Black Wings. Okay, so it's definitely not pay the bills instead. Black Wings are crazy good at spamming out some of the strongest boards in the game. The Bestial Monsters aren't as powerful. I'm gonna put it in the B tier. And the reason why is because Black Wings don't necessarily have a weakness in their game, kind of like how Altergeist do. But the problem with Black Wings is that it is weak to what the opponents are playing. As a Black Wing player myself, one thing that I have to say about the deck is that you have to squeeze all of the utility out of every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Card. And one big knock right now is that the Bestial Monsters are not as strong. If you do decide to play the Bestial Monsters, which actually do help Black Wings with Synchro Summoning and such, there are a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that aren't weak to these particular cards, and that's what put Black Wings at an interesting spot. Overall though, I think B tier is definitely where it's at though. It's still a fairly powerful deck and should not be slept on. Crystal Beast, my boy. My guy, the Legendary Collection was actually bad for Crystal Beast. It's crazy because I know you're probably thinking Pot of Prosperity is great for the deck, and it is. But the problem is, what exactly are you getting? You're gonna excavate and get that Crystal Beast Amber Mammoth? That Turquoise Turtle? Huh? That Ruby Carbuncle? The problem with Crystal Beast is that most of the Crystal Beast monsters are not good. To be fair for Crystal Beast though, even when they came out, they really weren't that powerful, and that's why I'm gonna put Crystal Beast in Pay the Bills instead. Now the spell and trap cards for Crystal Beast are incredible, but the reason why I put it in Pay the Bills instead, because of the main reason why you buy the structure deck is because Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, and the Legendary Rarity Collection set has Ash Blossom now. Probably for cheaper too. It's really unfortunate that I gotta kick Crystal Beast when it's down, so let's move on to Ignister. I like that all of the Cyberse monsters pretty much interconnect and you can play one with another. So with that, there is actually some upgradability for Ignister. You can play it pure, you can play it Mathmech, you can play so many different cards in it. One thing that I have noticed is that a lot of people are using Kaiju Monsters. I would say that it's a solid B tier Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. It doesn't necessarily get a lot cheaper because of the Anniversary set, but it's already a deck that was really cheap, and a benefit is that you can change a lot of the parts from this deck to some of the other Cyberse decks. Dark World, my boy. Welcome to the Dark World. I may have ate all the cookies. Don't be mad, bro. They was fire. They was macadamia nut. The best thing about Dark World is that you can get pretty much everything with 3 structure decks, and you can upgrade it to be really powerful. Also, if players aren't prepared for Dark World, this deck is crazy good. The problem right now is that, ironically, players are prepared for Dark World, so it's in that A tier for me. Now, in any event that these popular cards stop being played that just so happen to be good against Dark World, the new Kin and Jin make Dark World completely crazy. So yeah, it might even get to the S tier, which is ridiculous for a budget Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. Big ups to Dino Morphia for already being a ridiculously cheap budget Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. I actually have a series called Brokey Challenge where we built this deck for $5 whole. Dino Morphia also just so happened to get a top 32 at YCS Richmond, but if I had to put it on the budget tier list for the average player, I would say C tier. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is in an interesting spot, and if your particular area is so heavily focused on monster effects, then Dino Morphia can completely thrive. But there are actually a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that can remove monsters from the field or don't necessarily rely on monster effects, making Dino Morphia Rexstrom useless. Personally, Dino Morphia could be higher, but I think it takes a big-brained Yu-Gi-Oh! Pilot and the correct amount of floodgates to be able to win consistently. The crazy thing about Earth Machine is that players have been having success with it as of recently. It's been pretty cool to see Earth Machine on a rise, and just about everything for the deck is incredibly budget. I want to say the reason why Earth Machine wins is skill drain, but I know that's not all the way the truth. This deck summons really big monsters that are hard to get rid of, and that's actually a valuable trait in Yu-Gi-Oh! This deck is actually a lot better when people give it credit. It's a solid budget Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. Unfortunately, I want to put Elich in pay the bills instead. And the reason why is because how a lot of players have been using Elich is playing floodgate Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, and all of them because you can easily get rid of them with Elich the Golden Lord. Then there's also Inspector Border. Whoever made that card, I just want to have a conversation with him. I would put Elich in the C tier. Players are 100% ready for all of the things you want to throw at them, but I will give you a fair disclaimer. If you want friends, I advise you don't play this deck at all. Who needs friends when I have money? Wait, there's a budget tier list. Now, Exos Sister just so happens to be an incredibly powerful deck, and with Pot of Prosperity having that super rare reprint, I think that this deck is even stronger because it's a lot more accessible. While Yu-Gi-Oh! Is moving away from decks that rely on light and dark monsters in the graveyard that Bestials would be able to counter, decks are still really reliant on the graveyard. I think because of this, Exos Sister is an A-tier Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, incredibly cheap and still really powerful right now. I would want to talk about the upgradability for this deck, but again, just about everything you could use to upgrade the deck got reprinted, so it's pretty much capped off where it's capped off, but it's a solid, very solidly powerful deck. I'm almost conflicted on where to put Floowandereeze. I think right now in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are decks that reliant on special summon monsters, something that Floowandereeze takes full advantage of, but then there are also a lot of decks that rely on spell and trap cards to get rid of the opponent's monsters, and that's where Floowandereeze can struggle. I would still say it's an S-tier Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. One of my biggest reasons is because Harpy's Featherstorm is a game-ending Yu-Gi-Oh! Card. So is Dimensional Shifter. I think having game-ending Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards like that is a reason why Floowandereeze is looked at the way that it is. It is a fairly powerful budget Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. Though I will say though, Runic decks pretty much have it all right now. Against the decks that want to use a lot of spell and trap cards, Runic decks have always been notoriously successful against those. But then, just in case if the opponent is monster reliant, there are monsters like Furhire and Sprite cards to help you propel through them. If I'm being for real, I would say that this deck is an S-tier Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, really powerful right now, extremely balanced. Gold Bright Punk almost has all of the quantities to be a great deck like Runic Furhire. It can draw a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards and can play a ton of disruptions too. But the problem with Gold Bright Punk is that it is weak to spell and trap cards that get rid of your monsters. I would still say that it is a solid B-tier Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, really good, extremely powerful, and being able to perform multiple extra deck summons gives the deck a little bit more versatility to be able to overcome the obstacles. Ironically, Labyrinth is a cheap Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. You guys can look it up yourself. Outside of Big Welcome, everything else is really cheap. There have even been builds not playing Arius to Labyrinth Butler, which I think is a pretty decent card, but I'm gonna say this is one of the best budget decks in the game, probably even the best trap Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck in the game. Labyrinth just also might be the most decorated deck in this entire tier list, so it's pretty logical that it hits the S tier here. I did see a comment that said that I was wrong about Marincess being an incredibly good rogue deck. I don't think he's correct about that. Marincess has its problems, but as a budget Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, it's still fairly solid. Make no mistake, guys. A good player can make all of these decks really successful, and that's what we've seen time after time again. But Marincess for most Yu-Gi-Oh! Players is going to be a little bit harder to play right now because it doesn't have a good way to go second and being able to play against the boards that your opponent sets up. Not saying that it's impossible, but other decks can just do it easier, naturally. Mathmech used to be one of those decks. I really hate that Mathmech Circular is at 1, but I still think that this is a solid Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. Small World getting a reprint alongside of cards like Lava Golem is actually huge for this deck, and the power in Mathmech isn't necessarily bad right now. My boys, I think ninjas in Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, they're pretty pay the bills instead, my guy.
Believe it!
If I could, I would shadow clone Jutsu them to S tier. Trust me, guys. Trust me. There's a couple of problems with ninjas straight up. The first problem about ninjas is that giving up card economy loses you games in this deck. You can't afford to play cards like Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence because they just simply don't do enough. Unfortunately, you get a ton of missed interactions because of that, and it winds up biting you back. The other thing about ninjas is that once you do get stopped, it really does hurt. I mean, maybe I am putting it a little too low. I would say it's more playable than Crystal Beast. Maybe not by much though, but the ninja cards actually do some great things. C tier is what I'm giving it. I think Pendulums are actually primed to be one of the better budget decks in the entire game. This deck is actually really fun to play, very versatile, and can really make some splash boards. If you're a Pendulum player, I think right now is one of the best times to pick up the deck because the deck is incredibly cheap and it's pretty fun to play. Planet Patrol is also a runic Yu-Gi-Oh deck, so I gotta give it a lot more props, but I'm gonna keep it in the A tier. Planet Patrol doesn't generate advantage kind of like Fur Hire does, but I still think that it's really powerful as it stands on the basis of being able to get rid of your opponent's spells and trap cards, but also summon some monsters that can be really threatening too. Rika is also a deck that is in the S tier as well. For the most part, this deck is ridiculously cheap and powerful. I think one of the only biggest things that you're gonna have to rely about is getting that triple tactics thrust. But outside of that, the deck can still be pretty consistent. Until then, it's a solid S tier budget deck. Rika is also one of the most decorated budget decks on this tier list. It'd be a shame anything less than S because it's still a very powerful deck. I think Scareclaw is also in that S tier. What I like about Scareclaw is that you built that deck up, and once you do get bigger in your budget, you can play a strategy like Vanadium, which has also had a ton of success. Getting the Scareclaw deck also gives you access to Visa Samsara, which a lot of cool combos can be made for other Yu-Gi-Oh decks. It's definitely what I would consider a gateway budget deck. Red Dragon Archfiend is actually a lot stronger than what you think. Personally, I think both Crimson Gaia and Red Resonator are incredible Yu-Gi-Oh cards. They can be played in so many other different Yu-Gi-Oh decks to freely provide a level 2 monster for quick synchro summons. But also with Red Dragon Archfiend, you can play an expanded version in decks like Labyrinth, and it allows you to get protection for your spell and trap cards through Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss. As for ranking it, I'm gonna put it in the B tier. My biggest problem with Red Dragon Archfiend is the same problem with Blackwing. I think when the Bestial monsters are able to shine, the deck is a lot better. But when the Bestial monsters aren't able to shine and you have to commit those cards to your deck, it becomes a little bit worse. Still playable, still good, but just a little bit worse. Shark players on my Rogue tier list did mention that there is a way to be able to Exceed summon into a Big Daddy Shark Boy without needing your second Exceed Armored card. My counter argument, you don't get Totally Awesome too. Soon enough, Shark will have 1-card combos involving Totally Awesome, which will be really good. Until then, I'm gonna say C tier. I think that there's a ton of potential for this Yu-Gi-Oh deck, especially if we get good Exceed Armor Yu-Gi-Oh cards in the future. Right now, we're just trying to detach those materials to be able to summon some powerful water Exceeds and get a Totally Awesome. One of the biggest takes for Sword Soul is that you got Baron de Fleur here. It being an incredibly cheap Yu-Gi-Oh card, this deck is solid as an A tier. If you know how to play the deck, you can do some wonders with it. If you don't know how to play this deck, it's crazy because a lot of times you think you're doing really well and then your opponent stops your particular play and you think the deck's terrible because you didn't prepare correctly. But overall, Sword Soul is really good. I even made a budget profile for you to go ahead and check out. Trap Tricks have one good thing going for them. The extra deck monsters are unaffected by trap cards, and that's something that a lot of players have been using to get rid of monsters. Also, since Trap Tricks are so cheap, you can even fit in cards like Star Crisis, which is really good for helping the deck going second and breaking boards. I would say Trap Tricks is probably closer to the A tier as a budget Yu-Gi-Oh deck. I think there's a ton of good things going for this Yu-Gi-Oh deck. It's trending in the right direction. It's going to be interesting to see what Trap Tricks can do going forward. And lastly is Virtual World, a strategy that you guys also requested. Virtual World is mad cheap. I think the entire deck now is like 15 bucks. The problem with Virtual World has always been the exact same thing: consistency. Unfortunately, there were no cards to help this deck become a little bit more consistent. I'm gonna put it into C tier because of it, but I will add an asterisk next to Virtual World. If this deck actually does become a consistent Yu-Gi-Oh deck, I think it can keep up with some of the better decks in the game. Of course, big dog, this is all I have for the budget tier list. If you disagree with something or you think I forgot a budget strategy, let me know. I also will be posting more stuff on my Twitter, so be sure to follow me there. You know I'm looking for your undying loyalty, as well as check out these other amazing videos so I can catch you on the next one.